call to remembrance the power of God. Go to Him in prayer. That's the first thing that Nehemiah does. Whenever we hit a problem, especially in the church, but really in any setting, we go to God in prayer. Number two, he took responsibility for sin. He said, I've sinned, my father's house has sinned, the Israelite people have sinned. The whole reason we're in this mess that we're in, exiled from our country and our city is broken down, it had to do with sin. And it wasn't Nehemiah's personal sin that broke those walls down, but he recognized his own sin, and he didn't take an excuse to not talk about his sin. He threw it out there. Number three, turn to the Word. Nehemiah reminds God of the covenant, but I think at the same time we can assume Nehemiah himself was reminded of the covenant. And so return to the Word. And then number four, he got up close and personal. From the very first prayer, he's asking, grant me mercy in the sight of this man, because he knows he's going to the king. Grant me success in my efforts. He knows he's going to Jerusalem. He's making plans as he prays to go get personally involved. So we go from there. We're going to look at probably about the first 10 verses of chapter 2 this morning. And really, we're going to get some insight on, he's getting into the plan now. How do you go about operating? He was planning and praying about it before. Now he's doing. So let's go ahead and start with the text. If anybody wants to read the first 3 verses for us, you can go ahead and with that. Thank you. That'll be good right there. We lose a little bit because we're not very familiar with Jewish calendars. Chapter 1 told us that it was the month of Chislev or Chislu. Now we're told it's the month of Nisan. Chislev is like our November, December. It was during the winter, early parts of the winter. The month of Nisan is in the spring, more our March, April. So it's been 3 to 4 months since chapter 1 at this point. And given the grief and the passion and the motivation to get something done that Nehemiah showed us in chapter 1, we would have thought something would have already happened by 3 to 4 months later. We're told, we don't know exactly, but it was a common practice of the Persian court to winter. They would pick up, and maybe the nobility would go to a winter palace somewhere, and the court would kind of take a recess, almost like we do summer break with our schools now, or even on a shorter frame, our Congress might take a recess towards the end of the year. Something like that. That possibly could be the case where Nehemiah has not gotten the chance to get around to the king. This could be the first time the king has seen him in 3 to 4 months as he's returned from his recess. That's one possibility. Nehemiah also says in this text that he was afraid. So you think back to the way that Esther conducted herself in front of the Persian monarch not too many years before this. She was afraid to go to him. That could be playing into it. But whatever the case, it's been 3 to 4 months. Think about what Nehemiah was doing last time we saw him. He was fasting and he was praying, and he's been doing that, I would assume, the whole time for the past 3 to 4 months. That kind of takes a toll when you don't eat on a regular basis, when you're stressed and in grief on a regular basis. You have to figure this only makes sense. When the king sees him, he says, "Why does your face look sad?" Well, you don't look very good. And right off, he can tell, that this isn't just sick. You're worried. You're worried sick. And so That's the kind of conversation that we're starting out right here. He's probably a little bit more gaunt than what he was the last time. And especially when you look at the very tail end of verse number 1, I'd never been sad in his presence before. This was also kind of a common practice of a royal court to kind of keep a cheerful demeanor and not be sad in front of the king. And so he's never been sad in front of him before, but now that the king looks over there and he is just worried sick, probably shows it physically in his body. And he says that he asks about it, and he got really afraid when he asked him. He asked, were you sad? That this is sorrow of the heart? So I became dreadfully afraid. We need to kind of backtrack on Artaxerxes a little bit. In our first class, we talked about how he has been proven to be a pretty nice guy. History bears out he was favorable to the Jews, and so he wasn't one that persecuted the Jews as others did at times. But you have to balance that against another concern, the way that Darius was manipulated to throw Daniel into the lion's den, the way that Xerxes was manipulated to decree a destruction of all the Jews, even though he was married to a Jew, Esther. This had also happened to Artaxerxes. He had unintentionally, maybe kind of intentionally, decreed something against the Jews himself because others in power around him told him that he needed to. Let's look at Ezra chapter 4 real quick, and we actually see the very correspondence that I'm talking about here. Ezra chapter 4, we could, this goes verse 11 all the way through 23. We could read the whole thing, but let's just read a couple of verses that we get the idea here. They send a letter to Artaxerxes. In verse 11 there of chapter 4, King Artaxerxes, from your servants, the men of the region beyond the river, and so forth. They tell them that they are trying to rebuild Jerusalem. The Jews are trying to do that. Verse 12, it says, they're building the rebellious and evil city and are finishing its walls. Now, we know Nehemiah is going to build the wall. So they were trying to do this back in Ezra chapter 4. But the governors around there send this letter. And they try to kind of play on the king's emotions or political concerns. Verse 13, if this city is built and the walls completed, they will not pay tax, tribute, or custom, and the king's treasury will be diminished. That's one way to get the attention of the king right there. And they go on, and verse 16, we inform the king that if this city is rebuilt and its walls are completed, the result will be you will have no dominion beyond the river. And so that's what the governors of the area of Israel send to Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes sends back the answer. You see his letter in verse 17 through 22. The long and short of it, verse 21, now give the command to make these men cease, that this city may not be built until the command is given by me. So this has played out with the king that we're talking about in Nehemiah 2, and he's sent this decree to stop the work that Nehemiah wants to start. So as Nehemiah he may have a good relationship with Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes might be a nice person and not really want to persecute the Jews, but as Nehemiah is wanting to take this project on, he knows Artaxerxes was the one that stopped it before. And just like Esther was afraid to go to her king, even though it was her husband, and plead for her people, the Jews, that's kind of in Nehemiah's mind as well here. So Artaxerxes starts this conversation, why are you sad? Nehemiah says, that made me afraid, because I knew the conversation is now. I'm about to have to ask for this thing that Artaxerxes himself was against not too long ago. He answers the king for the reason for his sadness. The city in place of his father's tombs lies in waste. That's in verse 3. A neat thing, maybe not ambassador, political type speech, a tact that Nehemiah uses in his speech. He never says the word Jerusalem. Never uses that word Jerusalem. He knows the king stopped the building of Jerusalem before. He doesn't ever use that word. If you look back in verse 3 again, the city, the place of my father's tombs. He uses that twice. He uses the word Judah twice also. Send me to Judah. You see that in verse 5. Ask that you send me to Judah. And I'm missing the other, verse 7. Permit me that I come to Judah. He says Judah. He says city of my father's tombs. He never says Jerusalem. That might be intentional there. I think it might be. So let's look at and what I want to do this morning, I want to go through the text, these first 10 verses, and then we'll back up and do some practical application. But let's understand what's being said first. Let's keep on with the reading. Somebody want to read verse 4 through 6. Okay, one thing that I just love about this passage, look at his response right in between the king's speech to him and his speech back to the king. The king said to me, Nehemiah has made his request and it's effective. The king is asking him what he wants. Said to me, what do you request? So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, if it pleases the king. And he continues with his request. This is great. Nehemiah has been praying solid intensely for 3 to 4 months. And yet, even in this situation, I mean, between the time somebody speaks to you and you speak back to them, he said, I fired off a prayer. I prayed to God before I opened my mouth. That is what is spoken of in 1 Thessalonians as praying without ceasing. I mean, he is a man of prayer who is just constantly in communication with his God. I love that about this passage here that it teaches us. And again, notice that he prays, send me to Judah, to my father's tombs. He's using that phrase instead of Jerusalem. Let's look at verses 7 through 8. Somebody wants to read that. Okay, we've already talked about, back in our introduction material, the incredible assistance that Nehemiah gets from Artaxerxes. I mean, all this wood, this political stamp that Artaxerxes puts on what Nehemiah's doing, the letters. He sends with him a contingent of military there to get the work done. What we don't see is the time that passes between, just in these few verses here. We understand from the dating of the 20th year of Artaxerxes, that's 445 BC, that's when this conversation has taken place. Josephus will tell us that Nehemiah didn't arrive in Jerusalem until 440 BC. So it takes him 5 years from this conversation to actually get to Jerusalem. And that really kind of makes sense if you start thinking about the resources that he's asking for here. Two things, political passage and wood from the king's forest. If you go back to Ezra 3 and verse 7, the same rebuilding just a few years before from the Persian monarchs, the king's forest was the cedars of Lebanon. That's where this wood is coming from. And so to cut down the timber that's needed, and they would have to put it on a boat and float it down the Mediterranean coast to about modern-day Tel Aviv, and then they would take it inward over land until it got to Jerusalem, and that's a very hilly, mountainous terrain. That takes some time to get that wood there in place. We'll read in just a few chapters that this work is done in 52 days. That does not get done unless all the resources are stacked waiting for Nehemiah to get there. And so the wood's going to take a little while to get there, to work out the political situation, clear the way for Nehemiah to come through and do this work. It takes a little bit of time. And so we're having this conversation now, but it's going to be a few years between this conversation and the end of this chapter where Nehemiah gets to Jerusalem. Let's see here. We don't need to miss the end of verse 8 either. Why does the king grant all this help? Nehemiah recognizes it was the hand of God that was upon him. That was the only reason any of this happened. Nehemiah never loses sight of that. We talked about him praying and being a person of prayer. He stays so close to God, where he's talking to God about everything, and everything that is blessed upon him, he recognizes that, well, that was God. I mean, he just stays close to God throughout this entire event. All right, let's continue on. Verses 9 through 10, and then we'll back up and try to get practical with it. Somebody read that for us, please.
Then I went to the governors in the regions beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent captains of the army and horsemen with me. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard of it, they were deeply disturbed that a man had come to seek the well-being of the children of Israel.
Okay, so he goes, and here we have our antagonists. These are going to be a thorn in the side throughout the entire letter. They're going to be stirring things up, trying to prevent what Nehemiah is trying to do. They have really interesting stories, I think, surrounding them. Sanballat, his name means sin has called into life. That's the name of Sanballat's name. Now, you also need to know sin is the name of their moon god. And so it doesn't necessarily mean sin like what we think of sin, but it kind of accords well with our idea of sin. But the moon god has called me into life. Other manuscripts, we don't have this in the scripture, but other people write about the governor Sanballat at this time. They write about his two sons. His two sons were named Delaiah and Shelemiah. Those names mean Yahweh restored and Yahweh rescued. So here this man, he's got sons with Yahweh-centered names. His name is Babylonian, with the Babylonian god. He's one of those who have mixed religions and mixed cultures. He's called a Horonite. Horon, or Beth Horon, was about 30 miles northwest of Jerusalem. So he's living there in Israel. Also, Horon is the name of a pagan god of the time, a Canaanite god. So it could indicate that he lives there in Beth Horon. Could indicate that he worships the Canaanite god Horon, one of the two. But anyway, what we see in him is this spiritual adultery that's spoken of so often in the prophets, where he's thought to be a Samaritan or a Sumerian, and he's mad about someone who cares about Jerusalem, but he's naming his children with Yahweh names. It's just this clash that doesn't really work. Tobiah is the same thing. Verse 10, Tobiah the Ammonite. The name Tobiah means Yahweh is good. So unlike Sanballat, he's actually got one of those Yahweh names himself. Yahweh is good. The term Ammonite doesn't necessarily mean that he's a foreigner. It just means that he's the governor of Ammon at this time in that same province. Also a Samaritan, also mixing religions, mixing cultures. And so that's our two antagonists. And they're going to be on Nehemiah the whole project, trying to slow it down. You recognize where it said in verse 10, they were deeply disturbed that a man had come to seek the well-being of the children of Israel. We know when we get into the Gospels, Samaritans and Israelites, they hate each other. They don't like each other at all. And this goes back and forth for centuries, apparently, because here we see it on the Samaritan side. And that's really the beginnings of the Samaritans, when the Assyrians or the Persians would come in, take the people out, then bring them back with their people intermixed, because they knew that was the best way to take over a culture. The Romans did the same thing. If we can pervert these and try to bring them over to our religion and then bring them back mixed, then we can keep our thumb on them. And that's what the Samaritans were. So Josephus is saying there's dead people lying in the streets of Jerusalem. Tobiah and Sanballat want it that way. They are mad that anybody would come and change any of that. Okay, let's stop with the text there and kind of rewind on it. what can we learn from any of that? Anything that flashed through your mind, any practical lessons that you saw in verse 10? What can we learn from this?
Well, Nehemiah didn't just go whining with the king. When the king, he already had a vision of what needed to be done. And and like you said, the way he presented it to the king in a way that would be unoffensive. But then when the king says, what do you want and how long, and when do you want to depart? When will you be back? I set a time. I told him what I needed. He didn't just go wanting the king to solve his problem, and you can apply that throughout life today. When you go to the boss with a problem, you should have a solution, not just go there. So
That's excellent. You see that in the church, don't you? When it's kind of a joke in the church, when you bring up an idea, be ready to be the one that's carrying out the idea. They're going to put you to work. Don't say, well, something needs to be different without also knowing, well, how can we put you to work? And that's the way it should be. Because when we approach the eldership or leadership or anything, kind of know resources are pretty much already doing what they can. Don't say something needs to be changed and we all need to change it. No, that's exactly right. So many times when an idea is brought up, don't just bring up an idea. Bring up, well, how long is it going to take? What's the money that's going to take? Nehemiah had a plan. I think that's wonderful. That's great.
this lesson, this morning when I was watching TV about ISIS and whatnot in Iraq, same thing basically crossed my mind. I wasn't thinking about this lesson, but I was thinking, we had Iraq, the war, and after we left, now this ISIS is happening. And but you think about it, they're wanting Americans to come back over there, take care of their problem.
Mm.
If the people don't ever take care of their problem, they're always going to have a problem because they take care of their own problem. They have to want to. You know what I'm saying? And America, it happens right here in America too, with the riots in Missouri right now. Same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Tragic thing, but what's happening? Everybody's focused on that tragic event is getting kind of dull because of all the rioting and stuff that's going on. You got to take care of the problem yourself and not worry about trying to get somebody else to take care of the problem.
And I would even say sometimes we pervert faith and even make faith the problem to where God's going to take care of all of it. I'm just going to start walking into whatever it is I think needs to be done. I don't need the details. I don't need to know a plan. Well, God's going to take care of it. And we need faith that God will take care of things. But we just can't just walk into anything with no plan and expect everything to just fall into place.
Start with you.
Right.
He had it pretty much figured out before he went to the king. If he hadn't, then probably nothing was done. Another thing that I think we can draw from this, no matter how good your intentions or no matter how desperate it's needed, you're not going to please everybody. There's always going to be somebody that's going to find fault, that's going to try to stop whatever it is you do.
You would think, I'm going in here to care after Israel, this guy whose name Yahweh is good, well, he won't have a problem with it. And you don't always expect where it comes from either, do you? But somebody's going to have a problem with it along the way. Expect discouragement. How do you think Nehemiah kept the discouragement from getting to him? Because we haven't read the whole book yet, but the end of the story is he presses through every single discouragement. Yeah, I agree. When the encouragement of God exceeds the discouragement of man, I think that's what we see in Nehemiah. And we've already seen he stays near through prayer. He sees the hand of God in everything good. And we read that in James. Every good gift comes from God. Nehemiah didn't make the mistake of praying for something and then receiving it and never turn around and saying thank you. Nehemiah was right there saying that the hand of God was in this. What do you think would have happened if Nehemiah, if the king says, well, why are you sad? And Nehemiah says, well, here's the thing. You signed this decree 20 years ago that's oppressing my people, and that's making me sad right now. Would we have the same response out of the king if he starts out that way? We've got to be tactful. I think Nehemiah teaches us that. He didn't even try to get political with it. We're told, and I can't remember the exact years, but between Ezra's rebuilding campaign that was put to a halt and this, 445 BC, there's been a couple of revolts with the Greeks and with the Syrians. Persia has put those down, but some have said, well, maybe now it makes a little bit more sense for the king to have a strong presence in Jerusalem to be able to deal with things like that. But Nehemiah didn't even go there and say, oh, king, it would behoove you to have a strong presence in Jerusalem. He's honest. I want to go rebuild it because I care, because my people, and I'm in grief, and because it's personal. He doesn't get blame game about it and tell Artaxerxes, you started all this, or there's a personal appeal, and that works. That works. What else? What else is here? Excuse me. I'm sorry.
Well, apparently you have to, if your servant has found pleases the king, he apparently had a relationship that he had built over time. He didn't just arrive on the scene and expect this to happen. He had invested in it.
Yes. That hits me where it hurts. I had an assessment at work about a year and a half ago, back when I was still doing accounting, and it kind of gets inside your mind. Have you ever done Myers-Briggs or anything like that? It tells you personality indicators and that kind of stuff. It tells you, well, this is who you are, and this is where that's good, this is where that's bad. Mine was kind of very task-oriented, and they said, the problem with that is when everything that you ever talk to with your colleagues or your boss has to do with the job or what I need from you, or you never really stand around the coffee and talk and build relationships. What happens is whenever they see you coming, well, he needs something. He never comes just to talk. He never really comes to build the relationship, and maybe that's a little bit too much ugly detail there, but that's kind of where my mindset just kind of falls naturally if I don't watch it. And so, yeah, Nehemiah had built a relationship before he needed something, and so there's more to stand on than just I work with you, you work with me. That's all we've got.
Well, I think was probably the only one that was in the position that could actually, get the king's attention and get him to make this decree.
Exactly. Ezra needed it. I say 15, 20 years ago. That's the time frame, kind of, sort of. I can't remember exactly. But Ezra couldn't do his work because he didn't have this kind of pull. Esther was the only person in the entire kingdom that could have saved the Jews when she did. You just never know when you're that person in that position. He was loyal. I don't think he was just pretending to be loyal. In verse 3, he said to the king, "May the king live forever." Just this very formal, but I don't think it was dishonest. Now, we're not supposed to be loyal to things that are against the will of God or go against God's authority, but I was reading some comments that Peter Drucker had made. He was a big-time business coach, management coach, and he talks about whenever you see a bright, not inferior, but a bright person working for a superior that maybe they don't feel is as competent, or they don't feel, maybe they feel, well, I'm being held back because I'm in his department, or I work under him. Really, I'm better than this. I need to do an end around the boss. I need to outshine and promote past this guy. So that never works. That usually never works. And for one, they probably don't realize why their boss is the boss. They probably don't appreciate everything that their boss does know and does do right. But just when people see that scenario, somebody trying to outshine and get around, that usually just doesn't really rub well against people. And it's usually not the way to get things done. Nehemiah was loyal, and it really paid off for him. I think we see honesty here. As I already mentioned, he didn't say, "Oh, King, I need a vacation. I would like to go to Jerusalem and just go hang out for a couple of weeks and then get down there and really try to build the wall while he was there." He didn't say, "Well, I'm going to go down there and I don't need much, but I need this. It's going to cost this. I'm going to be gone this long. I want to build this city because of my reasons. It's not political. I'm not doing this for you." Now, he might have implied that this could help you, but what we see him presenting to the king is honest. That this is my reasons. This is what I need. This is what it's going to cost you. And that there's a rule, and I heard this said in a church setting before, some kind of ministers conference I went to. They said, "Never surprise your elders." And I think that's for ministers, for anybody, in other situations, don't surprise your boss. Don't surprise those who, be honest. Lay it all out there. There's no reason to hide stuff, and you're not going to get stuff done if you try to operate that way. Any other thoughts or comments? Anything else y'all are seeing in this text as we're going along? Yes.
Build that relationship, then you can have the comfort of having an open discussion without them feeling like they need to be on the defense.
So true. On things that have been written or said about evangelism, it just bears out time over time. The most effective evangelism is friendship evangelism. We need to be trying to reach those that we have not had prior contact with because they got a soul, and we got to reach them however we need to reach them. But the more effective evangelism events happen with those who you've got a relationship with. That's just the way it works. We've already talked about planning. That was really, really important. He depended upon God. I mean, he didn't just pray and then plan and think, "Well, I prayed about it, now I'm going to go do it." God was in there the whole time. I prayed about it, and now me and God, really God, is going to go do it, and I'm going to do my part that I can do. He depended upon God. We already read this verse and emphasized it. It's good to emphasize again. Nehemiah 2:8, according to the good hand of my God upon me. The king, we probably, by human wisdom, couldn't have expected the king to do this. He's going to the king saying, "You, king, decreed such and such a few years ago. I want you to undo that. I want you to pay for it. I want you to send letters with me to clear my way politically." And the king does even more than that. Nehemiah doesn't ask for the military contingent. The king sends that as well with no request from Nehemiah that we see here. We couldn't have expected that to happen just on man's terms. I just imagine Nehemiah praying to God about this. God, we're going to need, we don't have the stuff we need to build it down there. Well, ask him for it. Nehemiah said, would he do that? God has his hand in the situation. Maybe he wouldn't do that normally, but all this happens because of the good hand of God upon it. And so whatever we try to manage, whatever we try to push forward, and I think this chapter is all about working, and not necessarily working for God. I think that's included in it. You could use these lessons in your secular career. Just getting things done when you work with others, and especially when you work under others. I think this chapter teaches a lot of great lessons about that. Depend on God in those circumstances. Any other thoughts or comments? We got a couple more minutes. I like this kind of class where, hey, I've got an idea, y'all got an idea. Let's just throw them and mix them around. All right, well, we got about 1 minute, so we'll go ahead and wrap it to a close there and pick it up next week. Thank y'all.